Welcome to Research Methods in Sociology with Lee. You'll need your Research Methods booklet, which you can find on Moodle. You'll be able to use that as we go to make a few notes and find some key information. So let's make a start. So the plan for this week is essentially going over a bit of a kind of overview of what methods is and why we need to cover it, and then we'll spend some time, probably roughly about 30-40 minutes, looking at a bunch of really important key terms, and then essentially for the rest of the week you'll be left with a nice big set of tasks to complete to check and embed your knowledge and understanding of what we've covered through this video. So we might be thinking, why do we need to cover this? Essentially, it's really important to understand how sociologists gather the information that they use to formulate their theories. We need to think about what sociologists actually go and do when they engage with the public, when they're studying society. What are they doing? What methods are they using? And what are the pros and cons of those different approaches? And in an A-level kind of exam context, it's in 2 of the 3 exams you will sit next summer. It's in the first and third paper, and in total it's worth about a quarter of your final grade, so it's quite an important set of ideas that we need to spend a little bit of time on and make sure you're confident in. So let's look at a set of key terms which are fundamental to the next few weeks. So within sociology there are essentially 4 main types of data that we need to explore. The first 2 are on page 4 of your booklet. They are primary data and secondary data. So primary data is data which is gathered by the sociologists themselves. So they go out into the field, they talk to or watch or work with members of the public, and they gather data based on their behaviour, their responses, their thoughts, their feelings, their actions. Secondary data is data which already exists but the sociologist uses. Now that might be data from the government or different research bodies. It might be things like crime statistics, health statistics, unemployment, those kind of things. But it could also be stuff that the participant themselves has already created. So it might be things like Facebook profiles, blogs, Instagram photos, diaries. It could even be things like journalism. It could be anything that kind of already exists that the sociologist hasn't had to gather themselves. The other 2 kinds of data that we need to be aware of are what we call quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data is numerical data. Think of the N in quantitative for number or numerical, and it's statistical based data. We often see it in the form of percentages, ratios, graphs, tables, but it's numerical data that's showing us trends, patterns, quantities, those kind of things. Qualitative data, think of the qual as quality. It's very loosely defined as words, but really what we mean is descriptive information, detailed information, more kind of in-depth or even rich information that expresses people's thoughts and feelings. It can be visual, it could be photographs, it could be paintings even, but it's got quality to it rather than just simply being numerical statistical data. Now depending on which research method a sociologist is using, that method will give them quantitative or qualitative data, and depending on what type of sociologist you are, you will see one of those data sources as more useful, more beneficial and more helpful. So within the sociology of methods there are 2 main perspectives that we need to explore, 2 main ways of viewing the research that is actually conducted. So within research methodology there are 2 main theoretical perspectives, and they differ quite widely on how they view society, but also then the methods that we should be using to understand the society that we live in and the type of data that we should be using to make those judgments and that analysis. So if you turn to page 5 in your booklet, there is some information to help you which you can follow as we go through this, but the 2 main approaches are what we call positivists or positivism and interpretivists or interpretivism. So the first group of sociologists are what we call positivists, and they are the kind of scientists of sociology. They believe that society and humans can be studied in the same way that natural scientists might study rocks or forces or cells or organisms, using more kind of experimental, quantitative research, and therefore we should approach society in the same way that natural scientists approach their fields. So positivists essentially argue that we are puppets on strings. Nearly all positivists are structuralists, and therefore human behaviour is shaped by forces outside of and beyond their control. we are shaped by patriarchy, we are shaped by capitalism or value consensus and social solidarity, and we don't have a lot of kind of control over those things. They are external forces that shape and mould and determine our ideas and our behaviours. So therefore our free will, or the extent to which we have free will, is quite limited. Those institutions kind of control us and our thoughts and feelings. So as a consequence of that, there's not a lot of point talking to people about their feelings, their emotions. There's not a lot of point asking people why they did things, because they can't really tell you. They are acting as a result of those external forces. If you use the puppet on a string analogy, those forces are the puppet master or the strings themselves. We are robotic. We are, acting in a way that we don't necessarily have a lot of control over. Consequence of that is that positivists prefer that quantitative data, numerical data. They like those big trends, the statistics. They like to be able to be able to provide big patterns and to try and help explain some of those causes and behaviours. Positivists essentially argue that if we can't provide statistical trends and patterns to explain society and its our behaviour, then we're just guessing. If we can't back up our theories and our thoughts with data, with quantitative, hard, factual data, then we're just sitting around thinking about the world and we're never going to be taken seriously. So they're very kind of clear on what sociology is, how society works, and how sociologists should complete their work. Now, on the other hand, interpretivists argue that the strings are cut, that we have agency, we have free will, we can formulate our own decisions, opinions, our actions are our own, and therefore the behaviour that people demonstrate, the way in which people act, is a product of how they think and feel about the society they live in, how they react and interact with the people around them, the meanings that they give to different social institutions or different kind of actions or events in their lives. And therefore the job of a sociologist is to really get under the skin and inside the head of individuals to try and better understand why they've behaved the way they have. Now, there's only really one way you can do that. As a result, you are kind of looking for methodologies which try to better understand people's point of view. Using numbers doesn't really tell us anything about the behaviour of individuals. We need to start imposing methods which help us to understand the meanings and motives of those individuals. Now, the consequence of all of that is they will use a certain set of methods, but ultimately methods which produce qualitative data. So methods which produce detailed, descriptive, rich, accurate, truthful, honest information about people's feelings and emotions and habits. They're really looking for that level of detail and depth. That will come from methods such as interviews and observations, which we'll learn about more in the coming weeks, but it can also come from those secondary sources that we mentioned, those kind of more personal or descriptive sources of secondary data. Now, what you've got in front of you now is a kind of summary of those two different views. So at the top is the stuff that we've kind of covered, the structuralism versus social action, the quantitative, qualitative, the red methods. And underneath these words in blue are some of the phrases or key terms that we might use when we're describing and analysing the perspective and the thought process of these different theories. So it might be worth having a bit of a pause of the video and having a look through some of those and thinking about how you might help to remember or use some of those in different essays. Now, before we kind of push on to the other key terms, it's a good place to introduce something called the PERVERT model. And your teacher might use a slightly different model, but this is the one that I like to use. It's just simply a way of helping us to remember all the key things that you need to know when you are considering the usefulness of different approaches. This is not something you should use in an essay. You certainly shouldn't start a paragraph by saying, when we're thinking about methods, we must use the PERVERT model. This is simply a tool to help you as a student remember and apply the various things you need to know when you are evaluating and analysing a different research method. So it's called the PERVERT model. The P stands for practical, the E for ethical, the first R is for reliability, the V is for validity, second D is for examples, the second R is for representativeness, and the T is for theoretical. So we're going to spend about half an hour exploring these different concepts. and looking at the impact they might have on your research. So if we start with practical and ethical, if you turn to page 8 of your orange booklet or your methodology booklet, when you think practical, you need to think tramp. Now, quite deliberately, the first letter in PERVERT is P, because the first thing that any good sociologist will have to do before they begin their research is consider practical issues. So it starts PERVERT because it's the first thing you have to do in your research. TRAMP stands for time, research interest, access, money, and personal reasons. Now, if we look at those one by one, time is really about how much time you have been given, how long you think a piece of research will take, a piece of research is going to last or need. Also then thinking about the length of time or the duration that different methods might take. So what we often find is quantitative methods are slightly faster to kind of complete. It's relatively straightforward to gather lots of information, lots of data, lots of statistics from your participants through something like a questionnaire. But to complete something like an observation where you are living with and immersing yourself in the lifestyle and the culture of a group, that's something that takes months, probably years. And if you've been given a restricted time frame, then those methods may be off the table. They may not be, things that you can actually use. Research interest is really about who cares. So for research to be read, people have to be interested in the themes and the topics. Otherwise, it's just going to get dusty on a bookshelf. What we need to think here about is the people whose interests we need to kind of spark. So maybe the public, maybe politicians, maybe the media, certainly our peers and other academics. If our research is not interesting to those people, it's likely that it's not going to get off the ground. But it also means it's unlikely to receive funding, and we'll come to money in just a second. Access is really about how do you access, how do you get to, how do you find the people that are going to take part, the research participants. They may be difficult to access for various reasons. Now, on a really boring fundamental level, you need things like their address, and if you don't have that, then that's obviously quite tricky. But what about people who are in various institutions, people who are in prisons, people who might be in psychiatric hospitals, maybe children? They're more difficult to access. There's lots of permission and restriction that might be in place. Even a community like the travelling community, who are moving around, they're going to be difficult to access. So before you begin your research, you need to make sure you can actually get to the people that you are wanting to study. Money is about how much money you've got and where that money is coming from. So your funding body will often impose various restrictions in what they want and what you can do. They will also obviously determine how much money they are prepared to give you. So sociologists don't pay for research themselves. It comes from organisations like universities, governments, maybe even kind of businesses. But those funding bodies are going to have potentially quite a big impact on how you do your research, the time, the data, all kinds of stuff. And the other thing to bear in mind is that sociologists obviously want to receive some kind of self-satisfaction or notoriety or fame or fortune or whatever it might be from their research. So this kind of drive for career progression or respect might shape how sociologists do it or what they do. But equally, their theoretical perspective, if you're a functionist or a Marxist, if you are a feminist, if you're a positivist, if you're an interpretivist, those personal reasons are going to shape what you do and how you do it. And there's an activity later on to help you try and better understand some of these tramp practical issues. If you turn to page 9 in your booklet, you should see a diagram that looks a little bit like this. And the E in PERVERT, at least the first E, stands for ethics. It's the second letter in PERVERT because this is the second thing you then need to consider. So you've got your money, you've found your people, but you now need to think, well, how am I going to do this research in a moral, sound, respectful kind of way? How am I going to make sure that I don't harm the people that I'm studying unnecessarily? So when we're thinking ethics, we think DRIPS, D-R-I-P-S. The D is for deception. You should never lie to your participants. You should be completely honest and truthful with them. You should allow them the right to withdraw. If they want to stop, they should be told that that's possible, and obviously that you should respect that you should allow them to stop if they want to. Informed consent. They need to give explicit permission that they are happy to take part in the research. They understand what's happening, why it's happening, and they are fully on board with the research, and ideally you should get that consent in a written form. Privacy is about respecting people's personal information, making things anonymous, making sure that you're not releasing, intimate or personal details about those people. And safety is really about harm, protecting you and your participants, ensuring that you're not putting them under any unnecessary stress or harm. And we talk about 3 types of harm: physical harm, so physically harming them; emotional harm, potentially upsetting your participants unnecessarily. There are topics which will always create distress or upset, but it's about being forceful in your topics and your questioning. And then finally, psychological harm, which is actually kind of really harming or almost damaging somebody psychologically, causing unnecessary psychological harm to that participant, is something that we should be very mindful of and really never do. There are, of course, situations where these things are almost impossible to achieve. We will study something called a covert observation, and it essentially means you are undercover. The participants do not know that they are being studied. That means you're lying to them. If they don't know they're part of something, they cannot withdraw. They can't give you informed permission. They have no idea that they are part of something. And in different strange scenarios, you might find that actually as a sociologist, you are putting yourself at risk. We will look at studies of people joining drug dealing gangs and all kinds of stuff. And there's a definite air of safety kind of issues or concern in some of those studies that sociologists have to be kind of aware of. Now, it doesn't mean you can't do those things, but you have to be able to justify them. You have to have a clear conscience that what you're doing is, necessary, that there's no other way you could do this. Now, page 10, validity. There is space to make some notes. This is an absolutely fundamental concept. Validity is really about truth. But words like accuracy, honesty, whether the data that you get is genuine or shows a genuine picture of reality, authenticity, but also depth and detail. It's a really important concept, but it's about the kind of accuracy and the truthfulness of the information that you've received. So data will be valid, or is said to be valid, if it gives you a true or accurate description or measurement of reality. So official statistics on crime are valid if they show us the true extent of crime. But it's worth thinking about reasons why those statistics may not be valid or may lack validity. If you think about maybe stop and search rates, we think about the way that the police officers might use their own discretion to police certain crimes, certain peoples and certain communities, we might end up with statistics that are skewed, that don't show us the truth, and therefore they lack validity. So in a classroom setting, I normally ask a student just to ask me this question, but if I said, provide me an accurate or valid description of what Elvis looks like. And if I said to you, Elvis is male, and he's quite a good looking kind of dude, and he's got, nice black hair, would that be true? Is that a valid answer? And the answer is, well, yeah, of course it is. But if you then ask me that question again, I can give you a slightly different response. Elvis is male, and he's a pretty handsome dude, and he's got, nice black hair, and he's probably about, 30 inches, and he doesn't really blink. He's got big green eyes, and he's quite starey, and sometimes that can be quite intimidating. And he also he kind of pulls his fur out quite a lot, so he's got this kind of weird white ring around his tail. He's quite an anxious so-and-so. He's very, very cuddly, though. He really does kind of like to be around people, and he's very kind of sweet. But he doesn't go outside, so he has this kind of hair growing between his toes, which is kind of quite cute, and sometimes I sit there and kind of twiddle it. And I suspect you're probably thinking, what the heck is going on? And my point here is that, I can give you a true answer, that Elvis, is a guy with black hair who's pretty handsome, pretty good looking. But that lacks context, it lacks detail, it lacks kind of, real true validity. It is true, but it lacks the kind of level of depth and detail to really make it a truly valid answer, or an answer which is high in validity. Because really, that description can also apply to my cat. And as soon as I give you that extra information, you start to question, which Elvis is Lee talking about, and what's kind of going on here. And suddenly the whole issue of kind of a very straightforward, simple, quite precise answer can be thrown into question. We can start to really think about how important depth is and how important richness is in achieving valid answers. So an answer is valid if it presents a kind of accurate picture of social reality, but of course that means that you may face situations where participants lie, they are not truthful. That will get you a D, a D grade. We need to think much more in depth about reasons why or ways in which participants might lie. So this is quite important, and this is definitely worth a note in that box. So some reasons or possible explanations why people might not be completely truthful with you. Now, the first thing is they might sabotage. They might be out to sabotage your research for whatever reason. They might be trying to kind of sabotage and screw up the results. And sometimes that's called the screw you effect, when people deliberately give incorrect answers or mislead the researcher. There's also the issue that people might exaggerate. They might show off. Trying to impress someone, and they're kind of, talking a load of rubbish and kind of hyping themselves up and showing off. And obviously that's not going to be valid. Now, at the same time, that issue can also be expressed as people getting embarrassed. If you are being researched or spoken to about a topic that you find embarrassing, or by somebody that potentially you want to impress for whatever reason, maybe you find them physically attractive, that's going to affect how you respond. You may exaggerate, or you may be very cautious about the answers you give because you are embarrassed about the truth. And that's obviously going to mean that your answer is not completely valid. If you don't understand the question, people sometimes don't ask for clarity. They just kind of guess, they make things up. That's never going to give you a truthful, accurate, honest answer. And sometimes in a survey or a questionnaire, there might be some boxes to tick, but what if your answer is between two boxes? Ticking the closest box, the nearest box, that's not a truthful, accurate, honest, genuine, authentic box. So sometimes the design of the research can be quite restrictive, and being forced to tick the closest box means that answer is not truly valid. People sometimes rush, they're not concentrating, they're just getting it done to get out of the way. Perhaps you've offered them an incentive or a reward, and they're just quickly completing your research to get those sweets or that voucher, whatever it might be. But the other issue here is that sometimes people don't see everything there is to see. They might miss important things, important details. And that leads us to something called the Moonwalking Bear. Now, I'm hoping that you haven't done this before, and I'm hoping that it records in the presentation. And if it doesn't, then obviously you can go back and watch these videos separately. But let's give it a go. All you need to do is follow the instructions. Now, if I just pause it there, give you a second to think, press play. Okay, so think how many of you got 13? And normally in a classroom setting, people get 11, 12, 13, 14. Some people get the correct answer, some people won't. So when we repeat this 20, 25 times in a classroom, we don't always get a valid answer. Sometimes people miss a pass or add a pass. So there are issues of validity even when we're doing something as simple as counting in this way. Now, how many of you truthfully saw a moonwalking bear in that scene? And I suspect if you were counting properly and carefully, very few of you, if any of you. So let's press play and see what happened. Here he is. So the point here is that when you are concentrating on one thing, sometimes it's very easy to miss something else, which is equally as important. And that means that when you have two eyes and two ears, you're never going to get a truly valid answer. You might get an answer which is high in validity, but you're going to miss stuff. You're going to miss conversations. You're going to miss things right before your eyes. We can see the same kind of... So this example, similar kind of issue, just watch and concentrate. So, how observant were you? I'll just give you a moment to think. Did you notice anything strange? Anything fishy? Anything weird or suspicious? Or were you so busy concentrating on the events that before your eyes that you missed things taking place right before your eyes? So let's watch the end of the video and see what happened. 21 changes took place, and this is the making of, showing all 21. Okay, so it's the same kind of issue. When you are distracted by something, it's easy to miss lots of other things that might be taking place. 2 eyes, 2 ears, remember. And one third and final example here of a similar kind of issue. The kind of aim here is when you are looking for something, you are likely to see it. When you are trying to observe or spot something, it's going to be, there. You're going to notice it. It's going to be kind of the thing that you get focused on, and as a consequence, you might miss other important things. So again, same kind of issue. If you're looking for something that becomes obvious, you're going to miss other important things. So often what we find of observations and sociologists using their 2 eyes and 2 ears is that they will produce really valid accounts of things that have happened, but they won't be complete. They're not going to be able to record everything that happened in that situation. And that leads us on to our next really important concept, which is reliability. And again, you have some space on page 10 to make some notes. Now, reliability hinges on the difference between repetition and replication. You can repeat any research method, but you cannot replicate all research methods or all scenarios. So you can go and use the same questionnaire with a very similar group of people, and you will achieve very similar, if not exactly the same kind of results. So if I write a questionnaire about drug use and I take it to students at Vandine College, I will get a set of results. And if I take it to 10 different sixth form colleges around the country, similar kind of students, I'm going to get very, very similar kind of results. And that's because that questionnaire can be replicated. It's the exact same questions to every single participant. Not only am I repeating, but I am replicating, and therefore my data will be reliable. If I went to a football match and we observed the crowd and looked at crowd behaviour, and 10 of the sociologists produced the same or very similar description of the crowd and how they behaved and who was there and what they were doing, then we could argue the data is reliable. But what if some of those sociologists were American and they don't really understand football and they're distracted by the game and they're not really they don't understand like almost the culture of British football? Their descriptions might not be completely accurate. So we might end up with a similar pattern. All American sociologists report the same kind of findings, but it doesn't mean that their findings are always truthful or accurate. It might not be valid. So people will often lie about certain topics. If I gave you a questionnaire about sex, about sexually transmitted infections, about criminal activity, about drug use, these kind of things that people might be a little bit embarrassed about, people will lie. But the point here is that kind of all people will lie. So I could take that questionnaire to another college and those young people will also lie. I could give it to older people and they might still lie. So I'm going to see the same kind of pattern every time because I'm replicating same questions, but it doesn't mean that my responses are truthful or accurate. So sometimes we can have data which is incredibly reliable because of the nature of the replication and the similarity of all the different research projects. But it doesn't mean the pattern that we're seeing is actually truthful, accurate, honest, or valid. Now, validity is an important part of observational studies. When you're watching somebody with your 2 eyes and 2 ears, you often find quite incredible levels of honesty, accuracy, and truth, detail and depth, and rich information, but they're almost impossible to replicate. If I join a drug dealing gang for 12 months, I can repeat my observations by dealing with them day in, day out, living with them day in, day out. But I can't replicate a day. That day happened. I haven't got a time machine. I can't hop in my DeLorean and replicate a day. So often they'll be very valid, but they will very much lack reliability because there is a lack of replication. It's impossible. So if you think back to that test, our results were a bit dodgy in terms of validity. Some of you thought 11, some of you thought 14. Some of you didn't see the Moonwalking Bear, some of you did. Sometimes people don't see the Moonwalking Bear even when I show them. But if we think about reliability, we repeated that study 20-25 times, and not everybody got the same result. Not everybody got the same passes, not everybody saw the bear. So even when we repeat those kind of things, we don't always get reliable answers because it's hard to replicate those kinds of observations. So the second E in PERVERT is for examples, and you will pick these up as we go along and as we go through the different methods in the next few weeks. I thought it was helpful just to give you one slightly contentious, slightly kind of out there example, just to help try and embed and reinforce some of these issues. So this is a genuine study. So it's by a guy called Lord Humphreys. Lord was his first name, he wasn't a lord. And he wrote a book called Tea Room Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places, and he published it in 1970, and the research was carried out in the 1960s. And basically, Lord Humphreys was really interested in looking at the phenomena of men who did not know each other engaging in sexual acts in public toilets. Now, in the UK, you may or may not have heard of things like cottaging. In America, it was often referred to as the tea room trade at that time. And this was something that often happened within the kind of gay subculture. Men would meet up in public bathrooms to engage in sexual acts, but those men didn't know each other and there was no money exchanged or anything like that. So Lord Humphreys is thinking, this is quite an interesting thing to study sociologically. And some of the reasons behind that interest are the fact that, well, it is anonymous, it's quite risky, it's a little bit kind of, the public nature of it makes it a little bit, maybe a bit more unusual or strange. But this is also at a time when homosexuality is not only illegal but highly stigmatized. So why would men take these risks? Who are these men? What are they doing? What's going on in these kind of spaces? And you can see on the left there's a little diagram from one of the pages in his books of the toilet, and he's kind of mapped it out quite carefully, with the urinals on the left, the stools or the toilets, the sit-down loos on the right-hand side, left window, right window, and wash basin with door. Now, what we can then do is look at Lord Humphreys' kind of account of different events that took place. So we have here is an observational record sheet. So Lord Humphreys would hang out in this toilet in this public park and wait for some men to come in. He would kind of, observe what was happening and then rush out to his car and fill in one of these forms as quickly as he could so that he made sure the information was as accurate as possible. Now, there is some debate about the extent to which this is what we call a participant or a non-participant study. Participant studies are when the sociologist joins in and takes part in what's happening. Non-participant, they simply watch, they're not taking part. Now, the reason this is quite a contentious issue is because a lot of people argue that Lord Humphreys was taking part and some argue that he wasn't. And the reason behind that is that Lord Humphreys played the role of a watch queen. Now, that's not a role that he invented, it was a role that already existed. And essentially, he would stand by the window and keep an eye, make sure that if any members of the public, if any police officers or anything like that were approaching, he could let the other occupants of that toilet know, and obviously they could, stop what they were doing and leave as and when they needed to. So we're kind of questioning whether he was truly participating or not. It's important to point out that Lord Humphreys did not engage in any sexual activity, but he's still kind of participating in the ritual or the phenomena of what was happening. So we've got this kind of sheet that shows who was in there, what happened when, all these kind of things. So it's quite a rigorous and standardized approach. And he did this for a couple of months, and eventually he felt confident he'd been able to befriend some of the men that were in that bathroom, and he approached them and asked them if he could perform some interviews with them to find out a bit more about who they were and why they were there. And some of the men agreed, and some of the men ran away. But he managed to get some data about a bit more rich and valid data about what was going on. And then he waited about a year, and he had written down the number plates of the cars that the men had got out of, and he was able to contact the DMV, the Department for Motor Vehicles, and get the addresses, the home addresses of some of the men that he hadn't spoken to. And he wore a disguise and knocked on their front door and conducted interviews pretending to be from the health department with the men and their wives, about their relationships, about their sex lives, about their place within the community, all these kind of things which he was interested in, but undercover. So it's quite a contentious study because there's no informed consent, there's lots of deception, people don't have the right to withdraw, there's risks around people's personal information and maybe secrets or something like that they have, and outing them perhaps to their partners and stuff. So this is quite a risky study. And it was so contentious that when Lord Humphreys published his book, or when he released his book for peer review amongst other academics, there was a fist fight. There was a physical altercation between some of the professors over whether this was moral, responsible, important, disgraceful, all these kind of things. So you can start to see some of the ways in which sociologists actually do this work. And Lord Humphrey's justification for all of this, not only is this sociologically relevant and interesting, but he said, how else am I supposed to find out who these men are and why they're there? I can't just stand outside the door with a clipboard and a questionnaire and ask them questions. There's no way they're going to join in. There's no way they're going to take part. What am I left with other than a covert observation? That's the only way I could ever find out this kind of information. So he's able to justify lots of those ethical concerns, but think about the validity of that data. Not only is he getting data compared to none, but it's really in-depth, rich, descriptive data, and he's doubling it up with interviews and then a second lot of interviews. So he's gathering a really clear and detailed understanding of the behaviours and the people involved, the motivations, the meanings, all that kind of stuff. So a really interesting study. Okay, we're very nearly there. Our penultimate letter in PERVERT, the second R, is for representativeness, and on page 10 there is a bit more space for this as well. So the whole point here is when we carry out research, we need people. We need people to take part, and they're called our participants. We also then have something called a population. Now the population is the group of people that we are interested in, that we are talking about, that we are studying in the kind of broad sense. The sample is the group of people that we actually talk to or watch or work with. So the population is the group that we're interested in, and we draw a sample from that population. So if my sample of participants is taken from sixth form colleges in Sussex, I can then start to make what we call generalisations about Sussex sixth forms. But in theory, I can't make generalisations about any other sixth forms, or certainly 16 to 19-year-olds around the world. So our population is the group we're interested in. Our sample is the group that we actually study, that we work with. Another way to look at that is the population is that kind of bigger group that we are talking about. The sampling frame is the list of people within that group. Now it's smaller because we might not have the information we need. We might not have the names or addresses. We might not have the contact information, the locations of all those people. So it's often smaller than the group we're interested in. And our sample is the group that we then actually go and study, the group that we are ideally trying to create what we call a representative sample of. Now, a sample will only be representative if the people that we actually study, that sample, reflect and mirror that wider population. Now what we mean by that is we need to know the key characteristics of our population, we need to know the gender ratio, the percentage of ethnic minority groups, we need to know potentially the economic diversity of our participants, we might even need to know things about sexuality and disability potentially. And then what we need to do is be very careful, make sure that the people we actually speak to are the correct ratios and proportions of that wider population. So the people that we work with need to be almost a mirrored, exact version of that wider group, just smaller. So if we know there's a million people in our population, but we've only got the time and resources to talk to 100, we need to make sure we've got the correct ratio of women, the correct ratio of ethnic minorities and whatever it is. If we have the correct ratios, we can generalize. If we do not, we cannot. So really it's about whether our sample reflects the typical cross-section of our society. Do we have the correct ratios of key characteristics? If we don't, we can't make generalizations. So your sample needs to match your population in almost every way other than size. We're talking about a smaller version of. But that representativeness can be affected by things like sample size. If our sample is too small, it will be difficult to get the correct ratios. If our sampling frame, our list, is not complete, then we might not be able to get the correct people or draw people in the correct ways. And if our sampling method, the way in which we gather or create that sample, is problematic, if it's down to things like chance, then we may end up with a sample which is not representative. So on pages 12 to 14, you will see there are 7 main sampling methods, and your job now is to pause the video and have a read through those. Make sure you understand how that method works and what the pros and cons of that method may be. And there could potentially be questions around sampling, but we will certainly come back to sampling when we look at things like questionnaires and interviews. So I'm assuming that you've now unpaused. If you turn to page 11 in your pack, we'll revert back to the PERVERT model for the last 60 seconds or so. So on page 11, there's another little thing for the PERVERT model. And again, this is just a way of trying to remember all those key important issues within evaluation of methodologies. So P, practical, think tramp. E, ethical, think drips. R, reliability, think replication. V, validity, think truth and depth. We'll gather examples as we go. Representativeness is about whether our sample reflects our population. And theoretical is positivism and interpretivism. So if there's anything you're not sure on, then obviously you can go back and listen to a few bits, and if you've got questions still, then you can write those questions down and we can go through them at our next distance learning window, or next, our next lesson. Your job right now is to access the tasks PowerPoint, the PERVERT tasks PowerPoint, and complete all of the tasks that are on there. There's quite a few, but it's designed to try and reassure, embed, apply your understanding of methods, and we're going to take that work in at the end of this week. Thanks for listening.